There are many times when we need to have different states defined for our elements. These may be more common for buttons, where you have to define how a button looks when it is resting, when it is pressed, when someone is hovering over it, or on an entry when someone is writing on it, when it is deselected, when it is disabled. Or in our scenario right here, maybe we want to define different states, one for when this is portrait and one for when it is landscape, because if you can see on landscape, we still see this title and we have way less space in here because of that title. So maybe we want to change how the application looks, how the elements respond to certain interactions with the elements themselves. So again, maybe change how a button looks when it is pressed. Of course, maybe define it in SAML different to what the normal reaction is. Or in our case, what we're going to do is implement different states depending on whether our application is running on landscape or on portrait. So, new in Xamarin 3.0, there is a Visual State Manager. For those of you familiar with XAML in other platforms, you know that this has been there forever, but in Xamarin is something quite new. So what I'm going to do is simply define a state of this label. All I want to do is show or hide this label accordingly. So when this is in portrait, the label should be displayed. When it is in landscape, it should not. And of course, there are many ways in which we could do this. We could simply change the is visible to false and maybe make some evaluations in the code behind to know when this is supposed to be false. But what I want to show you is how you can achieve this with Visual State Managers. Of course, a more complex scenario is where you want these SAML states to define how a button is going to look when it is pressed or when it is not. But let me go ahead and show you this then. What I will do is simply, instead of this label, define the Visual State Manager's Visual State Groups. So we'll have to write Visual State Manager dot Visual State Groups. And inside, by the way, by default, all of those elements that can have a Visual State Group can define some common states. And the common states would be normal, disabled, and focus. So those are the states that you may want to handle for buttons: normal, disabled, and focused. What I'm going to show you is a bit more advanced, how you can set your own custom states. So define your own states. So what I will do here is, inside of the Visual State Manager, I am going to define that Visual State Group, like this. And of course, we can have many different state groups. And again, one of the most common one is here to call a Visual State Group the common state. And the common states, again, are normal, disabled, and selected. And here you would define each of the states for each of those, which are normal, are usually already implemented by Xamarin Forms. But I want to show you my own state. So let's call this the orientation states group. So something that I'm going to define myself. And these orientation states are going to, of course, be two states. I want one for landscape and one for portrait. So I will define one visual state like this and another visual state. And each of these states is going to have a name. So the first one is going to be the landscape. And the second one is going to be portrait. And inside of the visual states, I will have to have setters. So let me define the visual state setters. And this may be very familiar to you because this is exactly what you would set when defining a style with XAML, setters. And so inside of the setter, just like with defining a style, because this is the exact same thing, I could define the property, which is going to be is visible, and the value, which in landscape is going to be false, like this. And of course, in portrait, I would have to do the opposite, set the is visible to be true. And this is how we define these states. However, we are still not calling these states. The states that are called by default are the normal, the selected, and the disabled. Those that I said are common states, those are called by default. If we define our own states, like I'm doing right here, I would have to call them specifically. So I will go ahead and define something else in my C# file for this categories page. What I will have to do is know when the device switches from portrait to landscape. A very quick way in which I can achieve that is evaluating when the size changes. So notice that the content page has a size changed event, which is of course going to be fired when the size changes. So I can simply create an event handler for when that event is fired and simply evaluate what the size is. Or actually, let me just define a string that is going to be my state. Let me call this visual state. And all I have to do really is evaluate if the width is greater than height, which are again properties of the content page. If this is true, it means that we are on landscape mode because the width is greater than the height. And so I will set the visual state to be landscape. And I want this to be the exact same name that I set over here for my visual states. So I'm defining the actual visual state name that I need to set. So let me just copy so I don't make any typos in here. And of course, if this is not true, I will set this to portrait. So I already have the visual state that I need to set, either landscape or portrait. Again, this is going to be already the exact same name of the visual states that I have right here to handle. So now that the visual state variable contains the name of the visual state that I have to set, let's just set it. And for this, what I have to do is actually set a name for my label. So let me actually set the name to be title label. And all I have to do is call the method that is already called by default when the state of a certain element changes, with the ones that I have already mentioned that are already there: normal, selected, and disabled, which is from Visual State Manager, call the goToState method. This method is the one that is already called in certain scenarios. For example, when the button changes from normal to disabled, this is already called. So all you have to do is set the different names for the visual states that you want to handle, those three. But because these are additional visual states that we don't have by default, we have to do this. And all I have to do, notice that I have to pass the visual element. The visual element is my title label. And the name, which is going to be already the visual state. And again, I have already made the evaluation of what the visual state is going to be. All I have to do is pass that variable. And this is it. This is everything that we have to do. We are already setting going to the state that we need depending on whether we are on portrait or landscape. The basic evaluation here is whether width is greater than height, which happens every time the size of the content page changes. And then all we really have to do is call the goToState and go to the visual state that we need for the particular scenario. So let's go ahead and test this out. I am going to run this on the iOS simulator. This, of course, runs first on portrait, so we see the title, but as soon as I go to landscape, notice that the title is gone. What happened is that, of course, the size changed. So I have to evaluate again whether width is greater than height. In this case, it would be true because we changed over to landscape. And so the visual state would now be landscape, and that is the state to which we are going. And of course, if we change again to portrait, there the title is again. So this is, of course, a very quick example of what you can do. But this is something that you can do with many different elements. In fact, let me go ahead and show you. This is maybe not something that would go inside of our application, but I will define right below the label a button and show you those common states that I have been mentioning. So inside of the button, and let me right away name this button and set a name to it, I am going to again set some visual states. Let me just copy the states that I have set for the label. Of course, these are not the ones that I need. Let me call this common states. And let me define 3 visual states. The 3 visual states that I mentioned that are there by default. The first one has to be called normal. The second one is going to be the disabled. And the third one is going to be the focused. And all I want to do, in this case, notice that the normal is the first one to be set. And we didn't have to go ahead and implement anything called the go-to-state or anything. This is already there. That's why right here, because the first one is the normal one, this visual state is the one that is applied. So the is visible is set to false. But I don't want this. What I want to do is change the background color. So let me change the background color, and of course this will be a color. Let's set this to blue. And notice that immediately it changes again, because this is the name of a state that is common, either normal, disabled, and focused. And because the normal is the first visual state to be set, and this is already being handled, this changes immediately. And disabled, let's call this transparent. And by the way, the background color is the one that I want to change in all scenarios. So when disabled, this is going to be transparent. And let me just set the button to be disabled for a second, which is through the is enabled variable. Let's call this to false. And finally, if this is focused, let's call this green. And so notice that now, because this is disabled, the background color has changed to transparent because I have this is enabled set to false. Let me just get rid of this, and it is back to blue. But now let me go ahead and show you the focused one when this is green. For that, I will actually have to handle the click, because it turns out that for the button, focus doesn't really exist. It would be more for an entry when the user has pressed and they are focused, they are right there writing. The button doesn't really have this, but you can see how for normal and disabled, we really didn't have to do anything. We are not calling the go-to state. So let me for this create a couple of event handlers, one for when this is pressed. So let me just create a new event handler for that, and another one for when this is released. And so all I will have to do is over here for the button, which is going to be actually the sender. So I didn't really need the name, but still I can just go to Visual State Manager, called go to state, set the example button or the sender which we are receiving, and go when this is pressed to the focused state. And when this is released, go to the normal state. And again, I have to do this because the button doesn't really have a focused state, but you can see how again the normal and the disabled do not require anything like this because it's already by default handled by Xamarin Forms. Let me go ahead and show you how this button changes now. And so when I select it, notice that the background changes to that green color. And as soon as I deselect it, or I am not pressing it anymore, it is released, it changes back to normal, which is that blue background. So again, select it, I'm still clicking on my mouse, and as soon as I release this, it is back to normal. So for this, all I have to do is handle when this is pressed and handle when this is released, and call the go to state method accordingly. So there you have it. This is how you handle these visual states, how you handle them when you have your own custom states, and how you don't really have to handle them, you just have to define them when those are some common states, as is the case of the button when it is normal or when it is disabled. And the focused would also apply in the entries without you needing to handle anything. So now that in this lecture I have used the 2 previous applications that we have built to show you some bits of new SAML code that you can implement to do some more interesting things and some new things that are available now in new versions of Xamarin Forms, in the next section we're going to take a look at how to create a bot. So it's going to be quite an interesting exercise. We are going to be doing some things on Azure again. So we're going to take a look at something that is not necessarily Xamarin, but that of course we're going to be implementing here on Xamarin Forms. So starting in the first lecture of the next section, we're going to take a look at how to create a service that will allow us to easily respond to certain questions with predefined answers whether the user writes the question exactly as we wrote them or with slightly different words. Which means that this actually has some machine learning, some artificial intelligence already implemented into it.